Okay, so welcome everybody. This is 20 questions with Dr. Ayala Maurer-Prager. It's really exciting to be here this evening. We're doing this on a fortnightly basis. For the next 2 weeks before Pesach, we're doing this week and next week at 8:30 p.m. So you can join us live now. And also we're doing this again next week with another guest, also continuing aspects of this conversation on Black Lives Matter, race, and diversity in the UK. This video will be available on Instagram, on YouTube afterwards, so people can, who are watching now, can also send this out to friends, family, and community to spread a little bit of this message and raise these voices that we're raising up in this 20 question series. We're happy to be joined tonight by, as I said already, Dr. Ayala Maurer-Prager, from now on Ayala. You've been a really outspoken person online who I've been following for a while and was really delighted to welcome you back a year ago when lockdown was just beginning to talk about Black Lives Matter, race, racism and diversity in the UK. You are a PhD from UCL in resilience and human rights, specialising in particular in the dynamics of race and gender in conflict and humanitarian contexts. I've really enjoyed our getting to know one another, both a year ago historically and also recently preparing for this session. You're currently working in threat intelligence and incident response for a global consultancy firm, which sounds like a huge job. And alongside of that, you're also somebody who's been really deeply involved in this advocacy work that we're going to mostly focus on this evening. It's really wonderful to welcome you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. That's my first question.
Well, I think you've done a pretty good job of summarizing me and the things I've done. I think just to add, I'm Ayala. Obviously, as you've said that already, I am a mum of 2 boys. I live in Northwest London. And as you said, my day job is quite different to the work that we're discussing tonight. I work in cybersecurity consulting by day, and then in my spare time, Ravioli, as you've said, and as you know, a lot of the advocacy work and talking about different topics that I feel strongly about. I guess it's a good outlet in some ways, but that's pretty much me.
Great. So I'm not going to do too many plugs for next week in your presence, because we want to hear from you, but we're doing this inside-outside picture in relation to the topics that we're going to try and cover this evening. Next week is with Leon Lynch, who's a lawyer not from inside the Jewish community, and who was also on a panel with you a year ago, and is going to talk about his experience of racism, and that will be another part of this story in continuity for next week. That's a little experiment that we haven't done before, to try and do 2 weeks which one relate to another. Ayala, I guess my second question is about how you got, actually in both of your, both parts of yourself, how you got to your work that you're doing professionally now as your day job, and also how you got to this work in advocacy.
I guess in terms of the day job, it's a funny question, because if you would have asked me a year ago, do you ever see yourself working in cybersecurity, I would have probably laughed at you. So I actually got into it after I finished maternity leave, after I gave birth to my second son, Zach. I had just finished my PhD and thinking about where to go next. I knew at that point that I didn't want to have a career in academia, just because I felt that, you know, I'm more of a people person, and the idea of spending the next 30, 40 years in libraries didn't really appeal. So I was very much at a crossroad of sorts, thinking, where do I go now? Who's going to value a humanities PhD outside of people in academia? And then I happened to come across the advert for my job, and the consulting firm were very clear that they were looking for people who didn't necessarily have to have a cyber background, but just had an advanced degree that required analysis, research, communication, evaluation skills. And at that point, I just thought, you know, what the heck, let's apply. And I had a quite good feeling about it from early on. So I harassed the recruiter, even though he said that, you know, based on your CV, I'm not sure that it's a great fit. I said, I really do have a good feeling about this, put my CV in front of who it needs to go in front of. And it kind of went from there, and it's going really well. I'm really enjoying it. I'm training up in the cybersecurity space. It's unexpected, but you know, I've learned from this that you never quite know where you'll end up. And in terms of the advocacy, I don't necessarily see myself as, I guess looking at what I do and what I say, it's advocacy, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I do set out to advocate, but I wouldn't say that I come to, it's difficult because what I do is advocacy, but I guess I don't think of it that way. I just see it as saying what I think, which is something for me to think about perhaps, but I've always been vocal. As my parents will tell you, always been very clear about my opinions and very happy to share them. So it's something that I don't necessarily, I do it very consciously, but it's not something that I think is a great reach for me personally from a characteristic perspective.
Are there parents on the call this evening?
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks, parents, for giving us Ayala. That's great. I know I'm fascinated by this because I said to you before the call that I was looking with a slightly different, like perhaps a little bit investigative lens when I went to your posts from the last couple of days, and you're producing, like, in my mind, impressive content in an area that's quite new to me. I'm relatively a newbie to Instagram, and it's a forum which is an interesting one in the sense that it has its own, it's kind of like Twitter, it has its own kind of brevity and its own kind of style, and you seem to be nailing that in some way to get a message across about, well, tell us a little bit, for those who perhaps haven't seen you on Instagram, what does that content look like, a synopsis of that content for those who haven't found you.
Sure. So my Instagram is a project that I began during my doctorate. And Rabbi Oliver, as I said to you before, the one huge takeaway that I took from doing my PhD was that stories matter and people's experiences matter. So with that in mind, I set out to essentially create a gallery of sorts of people, their stories, their experiences, but most importantly, what people can do to learn more or to help or to lend their voices to a specific cause. So in terms of the infographic you mentioned, so every post has the same format. The first slide or tile is a picture of the individual's face, because faces matter as well, to give visibility, to add an edge of humanity to what can often just become stories and statistics. And that picture is followed by a brief, Instagram-sized synopsis of these people's experiences, what they went through, and then some analysis of the core issues at the heart of those stories. And then, depending on the appropriateness of the context, what people can do to either learn more or to help a specific cause. Yeah,
and just to be explicit, we're talking about largely people who have been killed. Not exclusively, but
not exclusively. Largely, it's a human rights based page. Right. So any kind of human rights violation or abuse, whether that's resulted in death or some kind of systematic discrimination. It's quite open in that sense.
Yeah, it's brave work. I mean, I think we share kind of two different aspects of this story, which is that I also came to the rabbinic work because I wanted to work with people in some guise or another, and I also love storytelling, which is part of the reason why this 20 questions experiment has been a really good boon for me. Because in particular, I want to talk about what it is to influence and what it is to affect the world outside, particularly at this moment of lockdown, where our tools and our possibilities of talking to one another and affecting each other's lives and raising awareness are actually limited largely to an online platform. So in some way or another, some of this work is even more important at this time. I wanted to then segue to the next question is, which relates, is what are the challenges and opportunities then of 2021?
So, I mean, well, okay, let's start with the opportunities. I think a large part of me is to keep up the momentum of 2020. So I think that in a lot of ways, both in terms of COVID and in terms of a lot of the conversations around politics and race that were brought up in 2020, there really have been conversations that have changed the way that we think about things, the way that we view things. So for example, talking about COVID for a second, the world of work and the way that we balance our lives, and cutting out commutes often means more time at home, and thinking about what that does for productivity, and completely change the way we think about our working patterns and our work-life balances. And I think that there are a lot of positives to be taken out of the fact that we've been forced to reassess the way we live and the way we work. And I'm hoping that going forward, workplaces will take that into account and start thinking about how flexibility might be the way forward. And I think it's had a huge effect, beneficial effect on working parents, but also in terms of, more with things with a more political edge. As we saw last year, a hugely political year in terms of discussions about race and gender, and something that's always a challenge, but I think something that will be a particular challenge in 2021 is making sure that discussions like that don't die with the news cycle. So, it's always a danger that when issues are topical, people engage with them, they talk about them, they're willing to ask questions in relation to them, and actually do a lot of thinking in relation to topics that they might not ordinarily think about. But once things die down, things disappear from social consciousness, from the media, I think a challenge for us, something that we all need to be conscious of doing, is retaining these conversations and taking meaning from them, and actually taking positive steps from them in order to move forward in a productive way. So that for me are the challenges and opportunities, I guess, of 2021. But talking of opportunities, for me, online advocacy is a world of possibility, because, for example, just giving you a very current example, I don't know how closely any of you are following, but the GET movement, the Jewish divorce document, the GET movement is picking up huge momentum, particularly in the United States, and that's 100% attributable to social media campaigns that have been running against GET refusers. People have refused to give a GET in the past, and the pressure that's been put on these individuals, on these men, by social media, by people who have stood up together as a collective voice and said enough is enough. We have seen in the last week alone, 3 women who have been, trapped in these dead marriages by the husbands for upwards of a decade have received their GET, and I think that is purely down to the power of social media.
Yeah. So just as a qualifier, in religious communities, women need a document to be able to get out of a marriage, and there is huge power placed in the hands of the husband, or in this case, or in some of these cases, ex-husband, who can use this document which the woman needs in order to be able to remarry and carry on with her life as a bargaining chip in many different scenarios. So what you're describing is,
and that's another conversation.
Go on.
That's another conversation that I think we need to be having in our communities, is the power that we give men over their wives. And I think thinking about making things like halachic prenuptial agreements mandatory, that is a really urgent conversation that we need to be having. And it is a conversation that's being brought to the table through social media and the way that people are using it. And I think the amazing quality of social media, and I say that very aware of the many pitfalls that come with it, the social pressures, the bullying, but one of the most positive aspects of it is that it gives people who don't ordinarily have a seat at the table a voice on issues that they wouldn't necessarily have the means to speak about otherwise. And I think it's there on platforms like Instagram and Twitter that you have these grassroots communities forming that, when with enough people and with enough voices, are really affecting a lot of very positive change that's been needed for a very long time.
Great. And that seems to me the silver lining. And you describe that, some of those shifts very articulately. I'd like to just circle back for a second. I'm pleased that we came to the question of gets, because that's certainly something which has featured in my imagination by way of social media in a more pronounced way in the last few weeks, when some of those, as you described, some of those posts have been coming at least to my feed, to my Instagram feed. I'd like to circle back just for a second, because I want to just take a deep dive just for a second into a story. So we have the story of Sarah Everard and her tragic murder, and it's still very fresh in people's minds, those who have read the news or any news about her murder. We're in an interesting place this week, because we planned this event more around the approach in May of the George Floyd anniversary, and for me wanting to take a closer look at Black Lives Matter in relation to Passover, the story of Passover, which is about our own freedom, our own exodus, and our own religious realization, and kind of reflecting on that in relation to struggles in our country and beyond seems to be apt. And then with this week, we have this intersection between Black Lives Matter and violence against women. It is noticeable that the current protests and vigils speaking up against violence against women this week have a little bit of an echo of what the Black Lives Matter movement has looked like over the last year. And yet we are standing up in vigil for a white woman who was killed. And I think part of the post that you're putting out there, in some guise or another, is also showing the inequity in that response. And in particular, I read a post that you put out about Bibawa Henry and Nicole Smallman, who certainly were both also murdered, and certainly received less attention in relation to their tragic murders. So I'm interested to get into that a little bit and take a bit of a dive into a couple of those examples.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think that, I think to take a step back first, which is I think where we need to start, is that yes, which we will get to in a minute, there is a large imbalance in the way that white women and Black women are treated in the media, and the way that their stories are articulated or not. But I think one thing to point out is that women, and this will sound strange initially perhaps, but women are often maligned in society in a way that sometimes people don't understand. And I think that the reason why Sarah's story has touched so many people and has elicited this mass outpouring of grief and outrage is that she really exemplifies everything that women are meant to do in public spaces to feel safe, and yet that didn't save her. And that's very scary to a lot of women. So, you know, when we are walking alone at night, we are told to always be on the phone to someone so someone knows where we are. We're told to wear bright clothing. We're told to stick to relatively safe, lighted streets. Sarah was doing all of that, and it didn't stop her from being abducted, and it didn't stop her from being killed. And as a woman, when you live in a time and an environment where public spaces can be inherently threatening, it's very, very scary to see everything being done right and the end results not being avoided. So the female experience as a lived experience is something that is very different and is sometimes maligned and misunderstood, as we've seen again across social media, people doubting the stories that women have been telling about their experiences. And it's something that a lot of people don't understand. So I think that's where a lot of the attention around Sarah's case has come from. So that's one perspective, but you're absolutely right in that Sarah's case has been given far more attention than, for example, you mentioned Biba and Nicole. For those who don't know, these were two women who were having a birthday party in a public park, were also walking home, disappeared, no one had heard from them. When they were reported missing, the police initially refused to investigate. And eventually when their bodies were discovered, it came out that the Met Police several officers in particular were taking selfies with the bodies and sending them around to WhatsApp groups, some of which included members of the public. So that's really talking to, very kind of critical race theory based conversations about the Black body in public spaces in relation to white, especially white masculinity. But at its heart, we have a lot of similarities. But yes, you're absolutely right in that. In an echo, I'm just the conversations we had this time last year are just echoing in my head as we're talking now.
Yeah.
And it's, in a way, nothing has changed, because we can see that the way that these stories are told, the way that these lives are valued and spoken about in the media is very different based on the color of these women's skin.
Yeah. So I guess yeah, I just noticed where you finished there, which is that there's a moment there where there's no wisdom to be shared. That's just, we have to make the observation and then.
I mean, I think it's important we state facts, because you can dance around them all you like, but at the end of the day, if we're really serious about having productive conversations, they need to be fact-based.
Yeah. So I guess that then brings us nicely on to the next question, which is, what does the Jewish community need to hear and understand? And the question was designed to speak about race, but it also now, in some kind of intersection of these two parts, also relates to gender and violence against women this week. What's the message that we need to hear in relation to these two areas?
I'm speaking, purely for myself, because everyone will look at these issues and take something different from it. But from my perspective, at the heart of everything you've just mentioned, absolutely there are intersections. And I think that at the core of that intersection, we're talking about tolerance, and we're talking about respect, and we're talking about an appreciation for the lived experience of other people. So especially when it comes to Judaism and racism, I think that a lot of the time, the mentality is we have to spend so much of our time fighting against anti-Semitism that racism is just, it's another ism that we can't deal with right now, or it's something that is very much outside of ourselves and something which doesn't necessarily affect us. So it's not really something that we can engage with. But to me, that approach, I'm not sure I understand. Sorry. To me, that approach doesn't really make sense, because at the heart of it, at the heart of tackling these issues and thinking about them in a really thorough and logical way, it's understanding that when one group is discriminated against, that lays the groundwork for everyone to be discriminated against. The boundaries don't stop with one. And when we allow white supremacy to flourish, when we don't check it in relation to the racism that it stands up against, white supremacy is also a threat in terms of anti-Semitism. The majority of anti-Semitism comes from white supremacy. So when we really think about what drives racism, who drives racism, a lot of the people who are racist are also anti-Semitic. So the two fights, as to put it in those very crude terms, are not so dissimilar. So that's one element of it for me. The other is that what is often forgotten about, specifically in, I'm talking about, white North London Jewish communities like ours, is that there are plenty of Jews of color who are within our communities who do experience racism on a daily basis, and sometimes from us. So I think that while sometimes there's the perception that racism is another kind of discrimination that we don't suffer from, I think that that's a really Ashkenormative view of things. And I think that we have to really look at Ashkenormativity within our communities and think about how it manifests itself, how we might challenge it. And then that really does have the potential to bring us to a greater place of understanding and empathy, where it should really have stood all along.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. We could be lulled into a false sense of security where we talk about anti-Semitism inside the Jewish community and racism outside of the Jewish community, and it's a false dichotomy. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking with Stephen Bush, who's taken on this work for the Board of Deputies, heading up their Commission on Racial Inclusivity in the Jewish community. And part of what he has to look at, and what he has been looking at, is this question of, exactly as you describe, racism inside the Jewish community, and what the experience of Jews of color is inside our community. It occurs to me that this is also, it's ki'ilu, a bit like the image of chametz, that we have to clean out our cupboards this time of year. For any observant Jews in the room or outside the room, it's a time of cleaning. And the image strikes me that part of our journey in relation to race and diversity, and all kinds of persecution which are out there, including this question of violence against women, is that we have to do a lot of that personal accounting at this moment to ensure that we are both on the right side of history and protecting those people most vulnerable in our communities. And that is a huge piece of work, I think, as you're describing, but also a really important piece of work, and perhaps one which is appropriate to glance upon and focus in on at a time of year when we're thinking about our own freedom. And when we say on the Passover night that everyone is each person themselves is responsible to look as if they themselves left Egypt, part of that is to look at our own personal persecution, our own personal freedom. And if these signposts or waymarkers in terms of vulnerability inside and outside our communities is an appropriate points of reflection, then I don't know what would be. I wanted to move to ask you about what your strength and inspiration have been during this time and in the work that you do. Can you hear me?
I say that without sarcasm, because genuinely my parents encouraged me to.
We lost you for only 30 seconds, so just loop back to the answer.
Can you hear me now?
Just for a second.
Okay. I think, in terms of my strength and inspiration, I think I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to any one thing. I think definitely from an early age, my parents in particular always encouraged me to ask questions and challenge things. So I would definitely say that I was always allowed to ask and to question and be curious. And I think that really set me up in a lot of ways for the work that I now do. But I guess I've always, in terms of inspiration, I've always been drawn to people who have either triumphed over some kind of great adversity, or just people who generally test the limits of what we think is possible. So whether, I think, going back to my academic work, people who have survived enormous acts of violence and racism and genocide and persecution and have come out the other side, and the way that they come through those experiences, that was really the focus of my research. The way that people reacted to experiencing huge traumas of this kind. But that's not limited to people who have survived what we call these limit events. People who test what's possible also exist as business people and explorers and scientists and researchers. So I think, to me, it's always about understanding what lines and limits are, and then trying to push beyond them. And I think that people who do that is inspiring to me.
That's actually, I find that very helpful for myself. Is there one person that one individual that you would draw on of these stories that you read and studied?
Don't ask me that.
You can say pass.
I'm going to pass on that, because I think that I would do discredit to all the people that I'm thinking of by picking one. Gotcha.
I guess we're going to talk a little bit about kind of switch a little bit in the next few questions, and I would encourage anybody in the room in our Zoom room now to type in questions to the chat that they'd like Ayala to talk to. We're halfway through some of our questions. What do you think? How do we join up the work that we do and speak to all communities about what the challenges are in tackling racism today? What's your message, a more global message perhaps, about fighting racism together?
I think that in order to foster that sense of commonality and togetherness, I think what can be hard to do, but is really important, is to find those points of commonality. So if you're thinking about engaging with a community that isn't your own, think about what are the themes that are equally powerful within your communities? What are the questions that you both need to ask? Now, it could well be that you're coming at those questions from different perspectives and different angles, but understanding that the importance and the power of the discussion is in the asking of the question, I think has real potential to build bridges. And I think, you know, especially in the Jewish community, when we're known for our division in a lot of ways, which is, you know, a really bad thing. But I think that, again, it's finding those areas of intersection, of which there undoubtedly will be many, and really trying to structure conversations to fall within those, but then also, again, to challenge those limits. So coming together in a common space with a common objective, but with ultimately a willingness and an openness to absorb the perspectives of other people, and just coming to discussions and coming to the table with a readiness to learn and a readiness to listen. And I think it's not always easy to do, especially within religious communities who are, you know, often full of very opinionated people, which is fine, which is good, but it's about channeling that. And it's, like I said, that willingness to listen and learn, that to me is the key to moving forward, even within and between different communities.
Mm. Yeah, and looping back to some of the metaphors of Passover about breaking our own bondage, breaking our own walls, so that we actually see other communities and other parts of our community in an honored and an honorable light, so that we can actually do work that's broader than just the person sitting next to us or standing next to us or in the walls of our own synagogue or locale. That seems to be important.
Yeah, I mean, Rabbi Oliver, if I can ask you a question.
Go
on. You know, you're
oh, the internet's going again. We're
how do you appreciate
you're broke up just for another minute. Hopefully we're not going to have that too many more times. Just ask the question again, because I missed it. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, in your position as a community leader, I'm sure that this is something that you've thought about a lot. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on those moments of togetherness and how they can be achieved.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are family members on this call from my family, and I married into a family which looks very different from my family and my own personal upbringing. I think I've learned a lot from that experience, and for me, at this point in my own career, I'm constantly trying to push at the boundaries of my own echo chamber, and this has a lot of relevance also for social media. It's very easy just to exist in a world that agrees with you. It's very easy, it's very comfortable to exist in a world that very much repeats back to you all things that you already believe. And my challenge as a rabbi, and my challenge in my current communal life, is to push on all of those edges, so that I'm always trying to listen and trying to get in with people who tell a different story about what it is to be involved in community, and what it is to struggle, and what it is to be active, to be activist. That's a real sweet spot, and that's also a real challenge. But I think that's how I'd answer your question. To switch the tables, we're gonna hear a little bit more about Ayala, because I'm part of these 20 questions is also to hear a little bit more of your own personal story. I'm fascinated to hear a little bit of transformative moments that have shaped you, of who you are, to be the person who's in front of us telling stories today.
Transformative moments. I think To be honest, I think
a transformative moment.
I don't think I could necessarily point you to one transformative moment. I think for me, it's been from a relatively young age, just I guess perceiving as a woman, as a female specifically, you know, growing up in the world, just how policed we are, from so many different perspectives, from the clothes we wear to our language, to the spaces we're allowed to occupy, to the professions and professional levels that, you know, that we reach. And I think just as growing up, as the awareness, as my awareness of that anyway increased, so did my dissatisfaction, I guess, with that state of affairs. So in terms of feminism, that for me was, it's been a very cumulative experience, but it's one that has grown with me. As you grow up, as you occupy different spaces, and you see what the boundaries are within each, and just growing up with an ever keener appreciation of where those boundaries are and not quite being happy with them, that for me has really influenced my feminism. And in terms of my thinking about things like race and gender, and trans rights, again, there's no one transformative. It seems basic and obvious that if I expect to be understood and respected for who I am, then I have to afford that to my fellow, regardless of who they are and what they do. So to see people not accepting those personalities, I don't understand it. It's, you know, no one is out to do anyone else any harm. And so to me, it's not any transformative moment. It's just a very basic understanding of who people are, what they stand for, and just a lack of judgment and an appreciation and understanding based on the person and not anything else that is attached to that.
And I think part of the story of this, some of the struggles which are ongoing right now, is, for me at least, is to protect the most vulnerable. For where violence is being done, where people are suffering, those are the places that we need to shed more light and tell more stories and be more aware and attuned in listening to some of those parts of our communities. That seems to be really crucial right now. Yeah, and anybody who tells you that story is important, yeah, I think you need to listen to the hurt and suffering of those people.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where stories really come into play, because I think often when we look at people who are not ourselves, we tend to look at people in very labeled categories. And I think that often those labels can be really dehumanizing. And I think it's when you read people's stories or when you take time to engage with someone else's experience that you actually give yourself an opportunity to look beyond that, because too often we live within our own echo chambers, and it's very difficult for those alternative views, perspectives, stories, experiences to come through. But it's only with a very conscious decision to break down those barriers and to actually start listening that you can engage on a very human level with other people. And I think it is a conscious decision to make. And I think it's not always easy, depending on how you've grown up and the ideas that have gone along with that upbringing. But, you know, even if you can't, for whatever reason, bring yourself to reconcile your views with someone else's, that's not an issue. No one is saying that you're a bad person for not being able to do that. But like I said before, it's in the willingness to listen and the attempt to understand that really has the potential to break down some of those walls.
Great. And I like that answer. Lovely that we have a whole festival which is about rehearsing and telling stories. It's important then to really hold those stories and tell more of them, about not just our own stories but also stories that are around us. We're cruising towards the end, so if anybody has last questions that they want to ask, put them in the chat. We have one question which came in which just asked about how do we, some of these questions are questions which are internal to the Jewish community. And with that in mind, how do we make shifts in the Jewish community that in our schools and community centers in particular, away from being so Ashkenormative, that we are only Eastern European Jews and not Jews of all colors and all difference? How do we make that shift?
Well, in terms of schools, I think one of the most important things is a broader teaching of Jewish history. So, for example, growing up, from my own personal experience, growing up, I was always taught about the Holocaust and the expulsion from Spain, but I was never taught about the mass expulsion from Iraq, and the history of Jews that didn't look like me, that weren't white or from Europe. And I think that a wider understanding of the fact that Judaism and Jewish people are not homogenous comes from a broader understanding of Jewish history and the places we come from and the people who make up the Jewish people. And it's far broader than we're taught. So from a school and educational perspective, I think it's broadening our curriculums, broadening the horizons of what we teach and what people know. And then secondly, in communal spaces, I think the most important thing is conversation. It's exactly what we're doing now. It's asking questions, inviting people to weigh in. It's about people feeling comfortable and curious enough to talk socially about hard questions. It's about parents encouraging their children to think about these issues. It doesn't always have to be extreme. It doesn't always need to be with politics at its heart, but I think it does always need to be with an intention of appreciating and understanding the breadth of both the Jewish people and the differences in their experiences, and the fact that despite all of that, we all do fall under the same umbrella, and an appreciation of the fact that although someone may look different, speak a different language, have different inflection, it doesn't matter. And it's about appreciating the fact that we all share something in common.
Thank you. So my last two questions are, I'm going to say a couple of words to sum up and then ask you my last two questions. I just wanted to, I'm going to give you the last words, but to say thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for, you make me, you're not that much younger than me, but you make me proud to be in this Jewish community right now, because you are raising up a really important voice and raising up a really important message, which is part of what this 20 questions show is about. We're doing this again next week at 8:30 p.m. the week before Pesach, continuing this conversation of Black Lives Matter with a lawyer, Leon Lynch, who's going to tell his own personal story of being a person of color who works in the legal profession, and we'll carry on much the same this conversation, I hope. We rely on the people here and watching this video to spread the word, so please share and like and comment on this video. My last two questions for you, Ayala, having thanked you profusely and said how grateful we are, is to just say, is there one question that you want to leave us with to think about, which we won't answer today? And then the last question is just to tell us a little bit of how we stay in contact with you and how we learn more about the work that you're putting out.
Okay, I mean, in terms of a question for everyone, someone once asked this of me, and it really made an impact on me, so I think I'll pass that on. It's to think not now, and this is not kind of for public consumption, so everyone can relax, but it's just to think, to try and identify one bias that you have and figure out where it comes from. And just, think about, does it come from something I was taught when I was growing up? Does it come from something that I once read? Does it come from just a feeling I have that I can't quite explain? And just try and get to the heart of that and see if there is a way for you to revisit the issue. You don't have to do a 180. You don't have to immediately change your mind, but it's just about revisiting something that you have very firmly stuck in your head that is negatively affecting your view of other people. So that would be my question or my ask. And in terms of keeping in touch with me, my user handle is the same across all my social media. So whether that's Twitter, Instagram, you can find me at Dr. Dr. _YALZ. So that's how you can keep in touch. But you have my number, Rabbi Oliver. So if you ever want to chat about anything else, you just give me a call.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Join us again for 20 questions. And it's been a delight to welcome you, Ayala. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me back.